True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
When 15-year-old Holly Harvey's grandparents forbade her from spending time with her 16-year-old lover, Sandy, both Holly and Sandy grew very bitter and antagonistic. Carl and Sarah Collier loved their out-of-control granddaughter, who they were raising while their mother was in prison. Carl and Sarah did not give up on Holly, but then they began to fear her. Join us at the quiet end for To-Do List. Holly and Sandy plotted against her grandparents. They asked around for a gun, they made a to-do list, and told their friends about their horrific plans. Then, one hot summer night, the two teens put their plans into action. Now be clear, there's nothing spontaneous about the horrors that they unleashed that night. In fact, their cold-blooded acts even shocked the most seasoned detectives on this case. Shocking, horrific story, Dickie. What are we going to drink to deal with this?
Oh, we should drink something heavy.
Heavy duty.
Yeah, because this is not a great story.
It is not for the faint of heart. Especially grandparents that are faint of heart. And that's me, you know. I'm a grandma.
Yes, you are. So we've got a beer from Terrapin Brewing Company in Athens, Georgia. It's called Reunion Beer. And it's a Scotch ale with 8.5% alcohol by volume. So the Scotch ales tend to be pretty malty and a fair amount of alcohol. And occasionally a little bit of hops, but nothing real hoppy like an IPA. So this critter, Reunion Beer, is a reddish-brown color with no real head to it. Has a nice caramel aroma, some dark fruit, and taste is caramel, raisins, and sort of an herbal finish. A little thin on the taste or in the mouth, but it's a decent enough beer. I would certainly drink it again.
Okay, let's open it up.
Let's open it up.
All right, let's go down to the quiet end and drink ourselves some beer. Oh, and talk about true crime, too.
Well, yeah, you got to do that. That's what we're here for.
All right, Dickie, start us out.
Now, we'll begin this story with the lives of Carl and Sarah Collier. Carl came from the small Georgia town of Cartersville, the youngest of 7 children, in a close-knit conservative family. In high school, Carl met his future wife, Sarah Jenkins. Almost 2 years younger than Carl, Sarah was playing for the girls' basketball team when he first noticed her. Surprisingly, at least to me, he was a cheerleader on the sidelines.
Well, yeah, you just don't hear about guys being cheerleaders that often.
No,
except, W.
In that time.
Right.
But he was, that's what he was.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Carl asked Sarah if he could give her a ride home after the game. Sarah politely turned him down. Carl, though, was a pretty confident guy, and he was not one to be quickly dismissed. So he asked her for her phone number. Well, Sarah refused that also. But that was because she didn't have a phone. So Sarah lived in a 2-room house that did not even have a phone line. In rural Georgia in the late 1940s, telephone was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. And Sarah's family was far from wealthy. Both her parents worked at a local mill, earning just enough to support themselves, Sarah, and her older brother.
Yeah, but persistence did finally pay off for Carl Collier. After repeated requests for a date, Sarah finally said yes. And a steady relationship developed, and they were married not long after Sarah graduated from high school. So she was 19 and Carl was 21. After they were married, Carl joined the Army and served stateside during the Korean conflict. And after his time in the Army, Carl got a job at a Ford assembly plant in Atlanta, then a position with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, before eventually taking a job with Delta Airlines in 1955. So Delta really had some phenomenal growth in the 1950s, and getting a mechanic's position with the airline was really considered a big win for an ambitious young man. Like many of his fellow employees at Delta, Carl prospered. He climbed to the position of manager of the power plant at the Delta Maintenance Depot. So Sarah and Carl tried, but Sarah couldn't get pregnant. So to start their family, the couple adopted a baby boy who they named Kevin in 1965. and then a baby girl, Carla, in 1967. So with a good income and 2 children to care for, the Colliers decided to move out of the city, and they bought a suburban home just south of the Hartfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport in Fayette County. So their new home was just 20 minutes from Carl's work, but it really felt like it was in another world. It was an ideal setting to raise a family, a middle-class neighborhood that was really full of hard-working, church-going people. The Colliers were as good of parents as anyone could have hoped for, according to their son Kevin. They never kept it secret that their kids were adopted, and it never seemed like an issue. They were always involved in what their children did, and they never stood in their way, and always seemed to help them pursue their dreams. But these 2 children, Kevin and Carla, really couldn't have been more different. Kevin excelled in school and had a gift for music, which was nurtured by his parents. Carla, a year and a half younger, was intelligent, but she was kind of an indifferent student who dreaded her piano lessons. But still, the Colliers were attentive parents. They always made a point to find out about their children's friends, and even learn everything they could about the parents of these friends. They believed a child's upbringing determined their character, and they didn't want their children to be led astray by any problematic peers. Church was important to the Colliers, and they tried to share their devotion to their faith by making sure that both Kevin and Carla attended the Fayetteville First Baptist Church. That's where they were even in the youth choir. And of course, they also had a church-sponsored Sunday school that they attended. When Kevin showed an aptitude for music, the Colliers began attending the First Baptist Church Atlanta, which was an hour's drive from their home. First Baptist had an outstanding musical education program and was also known for its orchestra. Kevin excelled in this program, and his parents would travel all over the country and abroad to hear their son play. Now, just hearing that makes me think that maybe Carla felt a little left out here, and that's possible. Yeah.
We'll see this time and time again. The older child
excels,
and the younger one, for a variety of reasons, can flounder.
Yes. It's hard to live up to.
Yeah.
Now, Kevin would gain honors for his musical ability and was even offered a music scholarship to the University of Georgia in Athens.
Well, that's pretty neat.
Yeah, he did well, but really sad for Carla because her adolescence was much more problematic. Kevin and his sister had a normal brother-sister relationship, loving one another one moment and hating each other the next, so not unusual. But then when Kevin left for the University of Georgia, which was a couple hours away in Athens, things got worse between his sister and his parents. The Colliers did not approve of Carla's friends in high school, and she began to challenge her parents' authority. On visits home, Kevin saw his parents get in knockdown, drag-out fights with Carla. That's how he described it. And most of the problems stemmed from the crowd she'd begun to hang out with at school, which was not a good crowd, apparently.
No, but, she wants to get her parents' attention.
That could be it. It could be that simple.
Do whatever she needs to do.
It could be, and also we don't really know what Carla's genes had in them, Maybe there was a tendency towards some kind of mental illness or instability. We don't know. But also, there seems to be a lot in the nurture aspect here, for sure. So it was in the 10th grade at the age of 15 when Carla dropped out of school and ran off with a boyfriend. The two went on a coast-to-coast trip and ended up in California. This boyfriend's name was Gene Harvey, but he had stolen the identity of his girlfriend's brother Kevin before they left. So Carla had provided Harvey with Kevin's social security number, and Harvey was then able to get driver's licenses in Kevin's name. Gene Harvey was in jail when Kevin found out about this identity theft. Harvey was jailed under the name of Kevin Collier. This was on January 8th, 1988. So this was difficult for Kevin. On September 4th, 1988, 27-year-old Harvey was convicted of impersonating another and sentenced to 1 year in jail. And it really took about that long for Kevin Collier to clear his name. His parents had to hire an attorney for him in order to clear this up, because this Harvey guy had gone all over the country, mostly California, and really just destroyed Kevin's credit, any kind of future he would have had.
It's a mess.
It was a big mess, and it took a long time to fix.
So once she got back to Georgia, Carla moved in with Gene Harvey. in a house 30 miles south of Fayetteville. Now, by this time, Carla's parents had resigned themselves to the fact that Carla was totally out of control. They did find some solace in their faith, and they were considered solid members of their church, but they were heartbroken. This gentle couple never had a bad word to say about anyone, and they were always the first to arrive for a church mission or outing, no matter what time it was. They were always the first to volunteer their time.
Which is great, but you have to think, did that make it even worse for Carla in a way? You know what I mean? Just so much perfection, so much to live up to.
It's tough.
It is tough.
I mean, if you're a bit of a fuck-up,
right.
It's tough to have everyone around you being great.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it. So on March 23rd, 1989, Carla gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Holly. Gene Harvey was listed on the birth certificate as the father. Carla had told her parents and brother that they had married, but neither Kevin nor his parents believed that. You know, Carla did tend to lie and make up stories. So Carla and Holly took Harvey as their family name. And when Holly was just 18 months old, the family was involved in a car accident that left Gene Harvey a paraplegic. So the marriage didn't survive that strain, and they broke up. And Carla ended up taking Holly and moving in with her parents on Plantation Drive. So the parents are thinking, well, this could be a new start for her. They're not exactly happy this guy ended up a paraplegic, but, you know, they didn't like him. And they were happy the marriage didn't work out, and they thought this could be a new beginning for Carla. But really not so much as it would turn out.
Yeah, but, you know, I can see the thinking.
Mm-hmm.
If we could only get that man out of the way.
Exactly, sure.
We'll be able to help our granddaughter.
Yeah, but it was more complicated than that.
Oh, usually is.
Mm-hmm. So Carl and Sarah were happy to have Carla back, and of course very excited to have their adorable granddaughter living with them. But unfortunately, maturity and motherhood had not mellowed out Carla at all, so she'd leave her daughter in her aging parents' care while she went out to party, sometimes all night. The Colliers loved Holly and they doted on her, but Carl and Sarah, you know, they were retired and they really wanted to take it easy a bit, do some traveling and enjoy life. So a second parenthood was really not what they'd had in mind in their older years. So, you know, there were arguments over Carla's lack of responsibility. Overwhelmed and exasperated, they told Carla that she and Holly would have to move out. And this was hard for them, but they didn't know what else to do. So they were going to kind of try some tough love. Carla did get an apartment over in Clayton County, and she took a job as a stripper at a local club, which you can imagine her parents were not thrilled about.
That's a good way to make money.
I guess, but, you know, in the long run, maybe not the best investment of your time.
It's certainly not.
And certainly her religious parents weren't into it. And then she was unable to find someone to babysit Holly while she was at work, and that happened a lot. So what she would do is she'd drop Holly off at her parents' home. Now, the parents wouldn't have minded if she was going to school or working as a secretary or something, but of course they weren't thrilled about this late-night job taking her clothes off in front of drunk men. Still, they never refused to take Holly because she was their granddaughter, they loved her, and of course they were concerned about her upbringing. So in 1993, the Colliers were relieved when Carla, with 4-year-old Holly, moved in with Kevin in his new home in a nice subdivision outside of Fayetteville. So they hoped that a stable environment for Holly would improve things. But that was not to be. Carla was unwilling to discipline her child at all. So little Holly ran wild in the house, and Kevin, you know, not a father himself, really kind of clueless, felt helpless. Holly called her mom by her first name, and it was a clear sign to Kevin that this girl had no respect for her mother.
Yeah, well, there was no structure in Holly's life.
No, and I think that's going to be a big problem.
So there's no bedtime for her, no wake-up time, no bath time, no meal with the family time.
Sure.
It didn't happen. And according to Kevin, the only time Holly had a structured environment was when she stayed with her grandparents. So by 2001, Carla had 3 DWIs, driving while intoxicated, twice with Holly in the car, and these were convictions for the DWIs. She spent 5 months in jail. Holly continued to stay with her uncle. By this time was old enough to be left at home alone. Kevin remembered the time when her mother was away in jail being a great time. He'd been able to create some order in Holly's life, and she was thriving and getting along well with her uncle. But Carla eventually gets let out of jail on probation and rejoined her brother and daughter living at Kevin's home, and family life deteriorated pretty quickly. One night, pulling into his garage after a day's work, Kevin was met at the door by Holly. She was in tears. She told him that she and her mother had a fight, so confronting his sister, an argument ensued, which became physical. So the police got called. And this domestic dispute, as it was labeled, was the last straw for Kevin. He threw both his sister and his niece out of his house. Carla and Holly were definitely a disruptive force in his life. Well, I'd say it was primarily Carla, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but it's getting to the point where it's getting passed on to Holly. And she's becoming like her mother in many ways.
Yeah. But when it was just him and Holly,
seemed like he was able to do it. Yeah. So I think that by the time that Holly got to be with her grandparents later on, it was just too late.
Yeah.
She had already been set in her ways. True. Yeah. So on April 2nd, 2003, Carla got into trouble again. And this time it was for distribution of narcotics. Now, she'd been arrested for selling marijuana to an undercover police officer. So Carla was back in county jail on April 29th, and she was looking now at a 3-year sentence, so it's getting serious.
Yes, it is.
Holly moved in with the family of a friend of Carla's. This was Haley Earwood, who lived nearby. Haley's mother, Connie Earwood, worked at a school over in Flat Rock where they enrolled Holly in the middle school. And it was there that Holly met and became best friends with Sandy Ketchum. And this is going to be her downfall, I'm afraid.
This is not a good pairing.
No. So June 6, 2004, Kevin got a phone call from Holly asking if she and a friend could come over to his house. Kevin told her he had no problem with it and told his niece it would really be nice to see her. So Holly and Sandy arrived early the next morning. Kevin had never met Sandy before. He couldn't help noticing that this 5'4", brown-haired, brown-eyed girl was dressing like a boy and not really talking much. Kevin had to run out of the house and take care of some errands, and when he returned at 11:30 a.m. that day, both girls were gone. So Kevin drove around the neighborhood and couldn't find any sign of the two. He waited for a while at home for their return, and then finally called his parents' house to see if Holly and her friend had gone to their house to pay them a visit. But he was surprised because his mother was really upset and angry that he had let the Ketchum girl spend time with Holly. She said Sandy Ketchum was not allowed in the Collier home, and they had told Mrs. Earwood that they wanted their wishes regarding Sandy respected there too. So the Colliers knew about Sandy's troubled childhood and her father's numerous wives. The 16-year-old friend was a bad influence on Holly, they said. So they sternly told their son that Sandy was never to be permitted to visit Holly again. And when that conversation ended, Carl dialed the Fayette County Sheriff's Office. Detective Phil McElwaney took the call, and Carl told the policeman that his granddaughter had run away and that she'd had a problem with drugs in the past and could be using them again. So after getting a description of the 110-pound, 5'6", brown-haired, blue-eyed Holly, and also a list of her friends, detectives made several calls over the next 3 days. It was a call they got on June 9th that seemed to be the best lead. Tim Ketchum was notifying the police that his daughter Sandy Ketchum was missing, and one of the numbers she had called the day she disappeared was to Holly Harvey's cell phone. So Ketchum told the detectives that his daughter might have headed for her biological mother's house, which was out in Griffin. And on June 11th, police drove down to Griffin to check on an address where they had learned that the mother of Sandy Ketchum lived. Holly was in this ramshackle house when the two detectives arrived. And once they identified her, they placed a call to the Fayetteville Police Department and arranged for Detective Debbie Chambers to take Holly back to Fayetteville. But Sandy, since she was with her mother, was allowed to stay in Griffin. And back in Fayetteville, Holly was turned over to her grandfather, Carl. Holly's reception by her grandmother, though, was very cold. Carl kept his anger in check, but he did lecture his granddaughter about her irresponsible actions. He also told her that he, her grandmother, and her uncle had really been worried about her. But Holly said nothing. It didn't seem like he could really get through to her now. And she went down to the basement to be alone, which is what she did with most of her time at home.
Yeah, that's where her room was.
Yes, that was her room.
That's not a bad escape place, really.
Well, no, but they wanted her to spend some time with them, which she never wanted to do.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And how are you going to get him out of the room?
Jeez, I don't know. It's a tough one.
So July 2nd, Kevin Collier got a call from Holly. She asked if she and Sandy could spend the weekend of the 4th of July at his place. Now, Kevin wasn't comfortable with the idea, because remember how things turned out the last time, back in June.
Right.
And Holly was supposed to be spending the weekends with her grandparents. But Holly pleaded with her uncle, complaining how much she hated staying with Sarah and Carl. Kevin had known she was miserable there, so he finally agreed to let her stay at his place after he got her assurances that there would be no trouble. Kevin couldn't see what his mom's concern was about Sandy Ketchum. Even if she'd come from a broken home, hadn't Holly also? His sister, Holly's mother, was a divorced single mom who was a stripper and a convicted felon.
Yeah, so it seems like Carl and Sarah had some idea that maybe they were a little bit better than the Ketchums, but really, Carla wasn't.
Nope.
I mean, Holly's family was not ideal as much as these grandparents might have wanted it to be. Really, at the time, Carla was sitting in a jail cell. So Holly's family background was not stellar. So it was kind of a case of the pot calling the kettle black in Kevin's mind. He had no intention of mentioning the weekend stay over to his mom either. Now they came, and Sandy again was real quiet, and Kevin felt like he had to dig stuff out of her. But otherwise, she seemed nice enough to him, even though she did appear to be, a real tomboy. Now looking back, Kevin admitted that he really hadn't put two and two together about Holly and Sandy being a couple. Their attachment did seem a little over the top, but as far as he was concerned, they were just two teenage girls hanging out together. Teenage girls can be very close like that. Kevin would learn that they were together as a couple when his live-in girlfriend Sandra Adams finally spelled it out for him. Holly had opened up to Sandra and told her that she and Sandy were lesbian lovers. And Sandra had already figured it out anyway. But as a 37-year-old bachelor uncle, Kevin didn't know how to support this relationship while keeping Holly out of trouble. After all, Holly did still have a mother, and she had a legal guardian in Connie Earwood. She also had two very concerned grandparents. So Kevin thought he'd just stay out of it and mind his own business, at least for the time being.
Well, it sounds like he just wasn't going to be comfortable with homosexuality.
I'm sure that's part of it. Yeah, I'm sure it's part of it. Or maybe he just felt like, he didn't really know how to act. He'd had this strict religious upbringing, probably not much experience with any alternative lifestyles.
That I'm sure of.
Yes. So let's talk a bit about Sandy's family and upbringing, the Ketchums. Tim Ketchum started going out with Sandra Fay when he was 24 years old back in 1987. Sandra Fay, 19 years old, was pretty and outgoing. She was also already divorced with 2 children, which is a lot at 19.
You think?
Yeah. So it wasn't long after their initial courtship that Sandra got pregnant. She gave birth to a healthy girl on April 19, 1988, and they named her after her mother, but they agreed to call the baby Sandy. So shortly after Sandy's birth, the couple got married. A truck driver, Tim knew it would be hard to support a family, but he was very determined to try. But their problems began almost immediately. Sandra didn't pay attention to her 2 kids or her baby girl, leaving her in dirty diapers and hungry most of the time. She was more interested in going out at night and sleeping in late. Family and Children's Services finally got involved. They were threatening to take Sandy away because of Sandra's problems with her 2 children from her previous marriage. The social worker was at their home checking on the other 2 children and noticed that little Sandy needed to have her diaper changed. But shockingly, Sandra refused to do it.
Why would she do that?
I don't know. She's messed up. After insisting that she must do it, Sandra finally did, and the social worker was very disturbed to see that baby Sandy had a severe case of diaper rash.
Well, yeah, if you don't bother changing diapers.
Oh, and it's just horrible. That's abuse.
It is.
It is. That's pain. Now, once, when Tim's sister Glenda stopped by to pick up Sandy, Sandra couldn't even tell her where Sandy's formula, diapers, and clothing were located. And then she even refused to help her sister-in-law look for them. So this lady's messed up.
She is.
Yes. So Sandra said her sister-in-law fell across her bed and acted like she was crying. But Tim's sister didn't see any tears. Now, when Glenda got the 1-year-old home, she was really stunned by the severity of Sandy's diaper rash, and she immediately took her to a doctor. So Tim constantly battled with his young wife over her lack of attention to the baby. And when he found out that Sandra had been deserting Sandy and running around on him while he was at work, so just leaving her home alone, he decided he'd had enough. So he threw Sandra out, and she took the baby with her. Weeks later, Tim came home from work and found a letter on the kitchen table, and it read, "Tim, come get your baby daughter." It had the name and address of where he could find his 15-month-old girl. So Tim went and picked up Sandy from the stranger's house and brought her home. A few days later, Sandra begged for forgiveness and asked if she could return home. So Tim did let her return with a promise of making the effort to be a better mother and a better wife. But it wasn't long before Sandra returned to her old ways. This time, Tim filed for divorce, and he did get sole custody of Sandy, something that Sandra never even bothered to contest. Sandra was ordered to pay $35 a week in child support, but of course, she never made any payments. Tim did try to collect from Sandra, but she never lived at one place long enough for him to even serve the papers. And Sandra never called to even check on the welfare of her child. So Sandy was definitely a neglected baby.
Yes, she was. Now, 2 years later, Tim married a girl named Mary, and Mary adored Sandy as much as she did her own young son from a former marriage. They were, in Tim's words, one big happy family. But Mary suffered a debilitating aneurysm, so hospitalization and doctor bills put the family in debt couldn't be paid off by Tim's job of driving trucks.
Some people just can't get a break, you know? It's really hard.
You finally find someone who's great for you and your children.
Yeah.
Your child. And she has this.
Yeah, it's very sad.
Mary had multiple seizures every day, witnessed by 4-year-old Sandy. Tim thought it must have had a devastating effect on his little girl. Now, subsequently, Mary had 2 more aneurysms, though realistically looking at her prognosis and the chances of returning to a normal life, she selflessly decided that it would be best for Tim and her to get a divorce. This would give Tim and Sandy a chance to get on with their lives without the burdens of her disease. So Mary moved in with her mother.
You know, I get it, I guess, but did you know that men are 7 times more likely to leave their spouse if they have an illness like that than women are?
That's not a surprise.
No, it's not a very good look for men.
Maybe the odds are a little different, but yeah.
Yeah.
So 3 years go by, and lonely and in need of a mother for his young child, Tim got involved with another woman, whose name is Tracy. So this time, Sandy was not yet a teenager. Tracy had a good steady job as a postal worker. She also had a child from a previous marriage. So in many ways, she was great, with a steady job and a commitment to take on the responsibilities of motherhood. When Tim dated her, she doted on Sandy. Looking back, Tim would recognize that Tracy had not been sincere. According to him, Tracy was intent on getting a husband who would support her. The couple moved in together, bought a house, and 2 brand new cars. And in December of 1999, Tracy gave birth to Tim's second daughter, who they named Peyton. Now, the new family quickly had problems. Tim noticed that Tracy would yell all the time at Sandy, and Tracy's daughter and baby Peyton were treated better. Sandy always seemed to be getting in trouble with her stepmother and was constantly being disciplined. Tracy would send Sandy to her room for hours on end, and after a few incidents of Sandy slamming her bedroom door in frustration, Tracy just removed the door. So Tim could see that this was not having a good effect on his young daughter. She didn't want to go to school most mornings and had to be forcibly taken there. So the couple remained together for almost 4 years, even though things were getting worse. In time, Tim began to suspect that Tracy was physically abusing Sandy. Then one afternoon, he caught his wife in the act. He arrived home early from work and heard screaming coming from Sandy's room. So he rushed into the room and found Tracy pinning Sandy to the bed with her knees, beating her. And Tim had to physically pull his wife off his preteen daughter. According to Tim, things cooled down after that. I hope so. But the peace didn't last long. Tim got a call one day at work from a neighbor telling him that Tracy was beating Sandy with her fists on her head.
Jesus.
So Tim raced home and confronted his wife. Now, he didn't want to believe it, And Tracy denied it had ever happened, but Sandy confirmed it when her dad pulled her aside and asked her for the truth.
Yeah, so we can see that Sandy has had a hell of a life.
Hasn't she?
Yeah. Just a few days after that, 13-year-old Sandy ran away. After school, she got on a different bus with a classmate, and Tim located her after making some phone calls, and he went and picked her up. When asked why she hadn't returned home after school, Sandy told her dad that she couldn't take the abuse anymore. So Tim Ketchum resolved at that moment what he had to do next, and the following day, Tim picked up his daughter from school and told her they were leaving. They went back to the Forsyth home that they had shared with Tracy, packed up everything of theirs, and moved in with Tim's mother. Now Peyton, Tim and Tracy's daughter, was left in the care of Tracy.
Now, why do you suppose he did that?
Left the baby?
Yeah.
Probably because he wouldn't be able to take the baby.
Yeah,
I guess she wasn't a baby anymore, but...
No, and Sandy's, what, 13
13 at that point, yeah, so...
Okay.
But I would just assume it's really hard for a man to get custody of a child anyway.
Yeah, but I think I guess he never witnessed or had any inkling that Peyton was being abused by Tracy.
Yeah, and it may have been that she just abused his daughter. That happens a lot, where they just pick on one child. So he was able to take Sandy because Sandy wasn't Tracy's child. But the couple divorced, and Tim was ordered to pay support for Peyton. Shortly after, Tim had to have surgery to correct a hernia that had kept him out of work for 3 months. And as a result, he fell behind in his child support. And then Tracy refused him visitation rights. And since he couldn't afford a lawyer, he signed an agreement drawn up by Tracy's lawyer that forgave the child support at the price of his not being able to see Peyton. Now, I don't know how that happened because that's a big no-no, using child support to take away visitation. That's not something that's supposed to happen.
No, you can't do that.
No.
At least legally.
Right. Well, if he agrees to it, I guess you can, and he did agree to it.
Well, yeah, he signed the agreement.
Right. I mean, he was at a very low place then, I guess. He was broke, out of work, and living at his mother's house. So all he really had at that point was his daughter, Sandy. And Sandy had loved Peyton, and she really grieved over the separation from her half-sister. So you have to admit that Sandy's been through a lot for such a young person.
She certainly has.
So at the Fayetteville Middle School, Sandy started hanging out with the wrong crowd. She and her friends began smoking marijuana, staying out late, and skipping classes. Still, Sandy got good grades in school. She didn't study or do her homework, but still managed to get all A's and B's. But then her problems escalated from minor offenses to more serious ones. Her behavior at home was erratic, okay some days, and moody and difficult on other days. Sandy was suspended from school 3 times because of drug use. So Tim finally put her in a rehab center on her school's recommendation. But Sandy immediately ran away from there. She was remanded by the courts to a juvenile center in Macon. Tim made that long trip every weekend to see her. And when Sandy was released, Tim and his new wife, Beth, decided it was time to leave Fayetteville.
So where did Beth come from? I haven't heard about her yet.
Yeah, he had a new wife named Beth.
Okay.
Not sure exactly when he met her, but she seemed like the best of the group. He finally met someone decent.
Tim's just kind of a marrying guy, isn't he?
Yeah, I don't think Tim liked to be without a wife.
Yeah.
So the Ketchums never had a problem with Holly Harvey, Sandy's friend from school. And as far as they knew, she was a good kid. In fact, of all of Sandy's friends, Holly was the one that they liked best. Holly would wear her hair up, she wore tasteful makeup and cute clothing. Now Sandy dressed different. She wore big baggy pants and shirts. Tim tried to interest her in sports, but all she really wanted to do was hang out with her friends. Now Sandy did show an interest in boys, and it wasn't uncommon for some to visit her. But then her big interest became Holly. So Beth Ketchum met Carl and Sarah Collier for the first time at Kevin's house when everybody was looking for the missing teens early in June. Beth remembered the meeting as cordial. When the girls were found at Sandra's house and returned home, Beth got a phone call from Sarah Collier. Sarah said she didn't think it was good for the girls to hang out together or even speak with one another. Beth agreed and had already decided to forbid Sandy from talking to Holly. When Sandy got home, she was told this news. She asked if she could ever see Holly again, or was this ban forever? Now, Beth never intended it to be forever, so she told Sandy that. When Holly ran off again a week later, though, Sarah Collier called Beth Ketchum again, asking if they knew where she was and if Sandy could be with her. But Sandy was standing right next to her stepmother at the time of the call, and Beth told Sarah that. It was then that Sarah asked if they knew the girls were gay and were involved romantically, and Beth was really surprised by this. Holly had stayed over and the two had slept in the same bed, but it never crossed her mind that there was anything going on sexually between the two girls.
So Sandy confessed to being bisexual, and Beth didn't know how to respond when Sandy asked her if she knew what that meant.
Yeah, so all of these adults seem a little clueless.
And now Beth, of course, knew what it meant.
Sure.
But regardless, Beth told her, Sandy was her child, and she loved her no matter what. But Holly, Beth said, would not be permitted in their home, and the girls would not be allowed to visit each other or speak to each other.
Yeah, now I don't know if this is based on trouble they got in, or if they're doing that just because they're lesbians, which doesn't seem right. I have a little confusion about what their thought process was. Well, although it does seem like they were getting into some trouble.
I think it was probably a combination.
Yeah, you might be right.
I mean, they were getting in trouble, so that's one thing. But
yeah.
The people involved might have decided also that they didn't approve of homosexuality.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking keeping them apart completely like that really doesn't serve to improve the situation.
No, it won't.
No, that'll make it worse.
So Tim Ketchum was surprised when he learned of his young daughter's sexual orientation, but he resolved to live with it, and he loved his daughter.
Well, good.
So by early July, the Ketchums had bought a house over in Franklin, in distant Heard County on the Alabama border, and they made plans to move. They took Sandy to see it, and she seemed happy with the house. But Holly and Sandy wanted to know why they couldn't speak with each other. And Beth lost her patience and told the girls that their ban from seeing each other was going to be permanent. There'd be no more Holly in Sandy's life. And she told her stepdaughter to forget her.
Well, that's just unrealistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, that's really not a good way to handle it.
So Beth spent the next 4 days in the house alone with Sandy. She knew if she took her eyes off her, Sandy's going to run away. Beth thought a relationship with Holly was a phase, and that Sandy would get over her. Beth kept away from any mention of Holly in a hope that she would avoid an argument.
Well, I think a lot of this keeping them apart came from Sarah and Carl, though, the grandparents.
Yes.
Because they seem very religious, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were very anti-gay. So I think that maybe Beth felt like she had to go along with that to keep the grandparents from getting angry. I think that might be part of it. So then Sandy started talking about wanting to have a relationship with her biological mother, Sandra. Beth and Tim agreed to allow her to stay at her mother's, but Sandra's home, in the words of Beth Ketchum, was just plain nasty. Walking in, they were greeted by 2 large dogs that had free rein in the house and were not house-trained. There was a dog pen full of puppies, and the house smelled like feces and urine. 2 more large dogs were barking incessantly from another pen in the backyard. There was dog shit everywhere. The room Sandy put her belongings in was unpainted and filled with junk. So Beth was disgusted. She even cried. Beth and Tim were hoping that Sandy would be repulsed by the place, and they begged her to reconsider the move. But she insisted she wanted to be with her natural mother. So the disappointed couple could only hope that Sandy would come to her senses and call them to take her home soon. The Ketchums finally hugged and kissed Sandy and left her there. But they did not feel good about it. They'd done their best to convince their daughter that her place was with them, but it hadn't worked. What they didn't know was that leaving Sandy with Sandra would set in motion a whole chain of events that would end with the horrible day of August 2nd, 2004.
So Kevin Collier was supposed to drop Holly off at his parents' house on Monday, July 14th, after she had spent the weekend with him. His parents knew and had agreed to the weekend stay over, but they were unaware she had had company, and that was Sandy Ketchum. Kevin wasn't going to tell them. He knew of their disapproval of the friendship, but he thought his strict parents were overreacting. Kevin had always found it difficult to say no to Holly. Kevin and his father, Carl, worked together every weekday morning house painting. So even at the age of 74, his dad showed no signs of slowing down. Kevin worked with his dad from 8 till noon, and then went home to get ready for his job at Delta. Kevin returned home at around 12:30 p.m., and after getting ready for work, he would drive Holly back up to his parents' house on his way to the airport. Now, back at his house, he found Holly and Sandy were gone. Kevin could already hear his mom criticizing him for allowing the 2 girls to stay at his house. And as soon as she got off the phone with her son, Sarah Collier filed a child runaway complaint with the sheriff's department and then drove down to the house in Griffin where she knew she would find a granddaughter, and she was spot on with that guess.
Yeah, she was. So Monday, July 26, 2004, Holly was taken by her grandparents to the Fayette County Courthouse, where she was ordered to appear in front of the juvenile court for running away. The court, after hearing the case, required Holly to have random drug testing and not to associate with anyone under court supervision, meaning Sandy. She also had to attend a 3-week program called Breaking the Chain, and this course was created to help troubled teens learn to make better choices for a better future. Holly also got 3 months probation, and then she was released to her grandparents' custody.
Don't you like how these companies or programs have all these great slogans and stuff?
I know, and a lot of it's bullshit.
Help troubled teens learn to make better choices for a better future.
Sounds great, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not that easy.
No, of course it's not. If it was, there wouldn't be these issues. So
Holly got 3 months probation and was released to her grandparents' custody. Now, after being excused by the court, the 15-year-old stormed outside and lit a cigarette. That was one of the few vices that was tolerated by her grandparents. Holly and the Colliers walked to Carl's truck in silence. The Colliers could see that Holly was very angry about the court appearance and sentence. So as they walked up to the truck and her grandparents got in, Holly took one last drag of her cigarette and crushed it out on the hood of Carl's Pride and Joy. He loved that truck. So it was an act of defiance and disrespect that just really made Carl furious. He grabbed Holly by the arm and hollered while shaking her that he was bringing her right back into court. Sarah intervened, got Carl calmed down. Holly had been through enough that morning, she said. But then Holly turned to her grandparents with a snarl and said, "I'm going to kill y'all."
yikes.
Carl said nothing about this incident to his son the next day. They were so busy working that Kevin had forgotten to ask about Holly's court appearance. Then on Wednesday morning, the subject finally came up. His father told him about her hearing and the incident with the cigarette. He also told his son that Holly had threatened to kill them. Kevin advised his dad that if he saw anything out of the ordinary, even something insignificant, he should not hesitate to call 911.
And I think that was good advice that wasn't really followed.
No, it wasn't.
No. Now, Kevin thought a lot about this situation over the next few days. He was worried. And he felt like Holly felt like a caged animal in his parents' house over on Plantation Drive. When she was with her mom, there were no rules, and she could do whatever she felt like. She could smoke inside, drink beer, even smoke dope. But at her grandparents', there was none of that. The wild teen was being domesticated against her will. And this is where the real trouble began, I think. Kevin knew it must have driven his niece crazy, but he also knew that Holly could be very sneaky. When her grandparents were upstairs, she was downstairs. When they were downstairs, she was outside. But his parents weren't stupid. They knew what she was up to and that she snuck out of the house whenever she could. From jail, Holly's mom, Carla, wrote her daughter a letter commiserating about what a messed up deal she'd gotten from the court. So Carla warned her that if she cared about her freedom, she had to straighten up, and Carla advised her to just hang in there since it would all be over soon.
Yeah,
so I don't know what I
not.
think about Carla's, the way she's talking to her daughter. I think that Carla and her parents should have probably gotten together on this.
Well, yeah.
And had the same message, but now they're giving her different messages and she's kind of in between the two. And her mother's telling her, it's really okay not to listen to them in a way. I mean, I know she's telling her to straighten up, but to say it'll all be over soon is not really going along with the fact that she needs to change her ways in a more permanent sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a nice sentiment that hang in there, things are going to work out.
Yes.
But it didn't come out that way.
Well, I think hang in there, it will all work out is fine, but hang in there, it'll all be over soon.
Yeah.
Is not fine, because that's not telling her to deal with things the way they are at all. So, on July 31st, Holly got another letter, and this was from Sandy. Sandy vented about what was bothering her. Holly had accused her of still being infatuated with another love interest and of planning to dump Holly, and in the letter, Sandy assured Holly that that was in the past. She asked why they couldn't just forget the past and live in the present. And then she wrote, "I love you so fucking much that it drives me crazy not to be with you every day." So Sunday, August 1st, Brittany Ann Jensen received a call from Holly at about 8:45 p.m. Brittany couldn't pick up the phone but listened to the message on her answering machine. So Holly sounded a little bit upset, and Brittany called her right back. This was a peer of hers, obviously. Now, she apologized for not calling her in a while, but said she would love to see her. The problem was that she and Holly didn't drive, and they had nobody to help them get Holly to Brittany's house in Lithia Springs. So at 9 p.m., Brittany said she had to get off the phone, but promised to call back soon. Holly said that she hated her grandparents, especially her grandma, and did not respect them. The next morning, Monday, August 2nd, as usual, Kevin worked with his dad painting a house in Fayetteville. At noon, he cleaned up, said goodbye, and headed to work at the airport. Nothing was out of the ordinary on that hot summer day, other than his having to leave work early to attend orchestra practice at First Baptist Church in Dunwoody.
Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Chris Miller, a family friend, called Sarah Collier about some books she had loaned him. They agreed that he would give them to Carl later that evening when he saw him at their local church meeting. Sarah told Miller that she was planning a vacation to Hawaii and was leaving the next Monday. She sounded exhausted and mentioned that Carl had urged her to go since she needed to get away. Sarah had been reluctant to go and leave Carl to look after Holly, who Miller knew was a problem child. So Miller asked if Carla was getting out of jail soon, and she told him that she assumed it would be in another month. Sarah said it would be great to have Carla take over the parental duties again.
Which is funny, because when did Carla ever take over the parental duties, right?
Well, you got me.
Yeah, a little bit of denial there, thinking that will happen. Now, she admitted that Holly was difficult, that she slept all day, smoked pot, and would sneak out of the house at night. She went on to say that their son Kevin would help Carl look after Holly while she was gone, and how her son was better equipped to handle the 15-year-old. Miller told Sarah how he wished they could try getting Holly into the Georgia Baptist Children's Home. And Sarah said they had no authority to do that, since they weren't even her legal guardians.
Oh, that's right. So on Sunday, August 1st, Brittany Ann Jensen received a call from Holly about 9:15 that night. Brittany couldn't pick up the phone, but listened to the message on her answering machine. Holly was sounding a little upset. So Carl Collier never made it to the church meeting. At 3:30 that afternoon, Holly called her friend Amanda Roberts, and she pleaded with Amanda to come pick up her and Sandy at her grandparents' house on Plantation Drive, telling her that they needed to get away. Amanda told Holly that she couldn't, since she didn't know how to drive.
well, that's a good reason.
That's a good reason, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
But this made Holly angry, and she hung up.
Huh.
At 4:37 that afternoon, Samantha Colon got a call from Sandy Ketchum. Sandy asked her if she knew where to get a gun, and Samantha told Sandy no. Why do you need a gun? And Sandy's reply was, so I can take care of business.
Whoa.
Samantha then turned to her boyfriend Mark and sarcastically asked him if he knew where to get a gun. So Mark took the phone and spoke with Sandy. And Sandy asked Mark at least 6 or 7 times where she could get a gun. And Mark kept asking her why she needed a gun. But Sandy wouldn't answer him. So frustrated, he handed the phone back to Samantha. The shaky voice on the phone admitted to Samantha that she was scared. When Samantha pressed her for a reason, Sandy said, I just am. I'm going to go to jail for murder.
Oh, boy.
Red flag. So Samantha pleaded with a friend not to do anything stupid and told her to come to Fayetteville sometime soon to see her. Sandy said goodbye and hung up.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, teens do say weird, stupid things. So I guess you wouldn't necessarily take that literally.
Well, I guess you have to look at the context of things, too.
Yeah, but we're talking about another teen that she's talking to, not an adult.
Yeah, and I don't know how good friends they were. She might not know much of the history.
Exactly, yeah. So, in the early evening of August 2nd, Sarah Collier noticed a strange smell coming from the basement of her house. Holly had been locked in her finished basement room, her mother Carla's old room, all day, and she had loud rock music blasting from behind the closed door. Then when Carl got home from work, Sarah told him she thought she smelled marijuana coming from Holly's room. Now, Sarah had reservations for a flight to Hawaii on Monday to visit an old friend, so with the excuse of gathering some luggage that was stored in Holly's closet, the couple went downstairs. Carl tried to open the door, but it was locked, so he knocked and he asked Holly to unlock it so they could get their luggage. Sarah followed her husband into the room when the lock clicked open. As Carl rummaged through the closet, he heard Sarah scream. Turning around, he could tell that Sarah was bleeding, and he saw Holly standing there with a boning knife in her hand. So Carl lunged for his granddaughter, and helped by his wounded wife, they pinned Holly to the bed and grabbed the knife from her. But then Holly hollered, and she yelled out, "Aren't you going to help me?" Now the Colliers didn't know who Holly was screaming for, and I'm sure they were surprised when Sandy Ketchum jumped out from behind Holly's bed.
I'm sure they were stunned.
Yes. So slashed and bleeding profusely, Carl broke away and ran for the phone that sat on a table in the living area between the two downstairs bedrooms. But Holly chased after him. Blood from Carl's wounds sprayed on the hallway walls. Before Carl could call 911, Holly cut the phone line with the knife, and then she repeatedly stabbed her grandfather with it. Carl managed to escape the attack and lurched up the stairs, but Holly was close behind him. At the same time, Sandy continued a vicious attack on Sarah. Sarah had managed to stumble out of the bedroom, but only got to the foot of the stairs, and then she collapsed. Convinced that Sarah was no longer an issue, Sandy stood over her body and just watched as blood gushed from her knife wounds. Even though he was severely wounded, Carl still tried to fight off Holly. He got to the kitchen and he grabbed for the wall-mounted phone. With the receiver in one hand, he fought off the girl's attack with the other. Holly tore the phone off of the wall. Trying to avoid the knife, Carl staggered around the kitchen island, leaving a trail of blood. And Holly continued frantically stabbing at him. He finally did lose consciousness and collapsed onto the kitchen floor. About 5 p.m., Amanda Roberts got another phone call from Holly, and this time Holly told her that she and Sandy needed to find some drugs, and she asked for a dealer friend's number. Amanda claimed she didn't know it. She could hear Sandy in the background frantically talking with Holly. Holly replied by saying that it was an emergency, and then she hung up. At 7:25 p.m., Samantha Colon picked up her ringing phone, and Holly was on the line, and she told her to be sure to watch the 10 o'clock news on TV, and that she would be surprised at what she would see. At 7:26 p.m., Holly made another phone call from her grandmother's cell phone, and this time it was to another friend, Virginia Roberts. Holly told her to watch the evening news too, and when Virginia asked her why, Holly just hung up. That evening, a friend of Sandy's named Sarah got a phone call from Sandy, and she knew it was coming from Holly's grandmother's cell phone from the caller ID. Holly and Sandy wanted to come to Sarah's house in Griffin because they were covered in blood since they got jumped and needed a place to clean up. The rest of the call was all gibberish, according to Sarah. Sarah's sister was in town, and Sarah didn't want her to freak out at seeing the two, especially if they came covered in blood from being mugged. So Sarah told them not to come to her house. But Holly and Sandy would show up anyway, just minutes after that phone call. And Holly was driving a blue Chevy pickup truck. That was Carl's pride and joy.
Yeah, but he didn't need to use it anymore.
No, Carl is dead.
So Sarah didn't want them coming into the house. Both girls, Holly and Sandy, were drenched in blood and smelled of iron and blood. The two girls pleaded with Sarah, saying that they needed help. They had been attacked and needed to clean up. Sarah looked closely at them and noted that they didn't seem to be injured. Both Sandy and Holly were nervously smoking cigarettes. Then Holly blurted out that they had just killed her grandparents. Holly seemed excited about this, but Sandy was white as a ghost. Sarah asked, "You killed your grandparents?" She had her cell phone to her ear with her boyfriend on the other side. Her boyfriend said, "What?" And he hung up the phone. Sarah put her phone down on the dashboard of the truck, and she asked the two girls, "Why?" Sandy, in a stupor, said she didn't know why, but admitted they were all cracked out, and Holly did not have an answer at all.
Yes, Sandy begged Sarah to let them in her house so they could take showers, but Sarah said no way. She told Sandy that if she hadn't been covered in blood, she'd drag her out of the truck and kick her ass. Sarah managed to maintain a calm exterior, thinking she had to get them away from her house, protect her family, and make sure she wouldn't be connected to their crimes. She also wanted to know if Holly's grandparents were injured or if they really were dead. Maybe they needed help. So Sarah went into her house and grabbed a towel and soaked it in the kitchen sink. She tossed it to Sandy and watched as the girls stripped naked on the dirt driveway. Sarah was shocked to see that there was even blood on their underwear and their socks. So the girls cleaned up with the bath towel as Sarah watched from her front porch. Sarah then realized that she had left her wireless phone on the truck's dashboard. She ran back down the driveway to the truck, and reaching for the phone, she saw a bloody kitchen butcher knife lying on the front cab floor. Thinking quickly, she told the two naked girls to dump their clothes and the murder weapons in the river. Sarah figured if she knew where they would dispose of them, she could later tell police where to find evidence. She just wanted them and any evidence to be as far away from her and her home as possible. And I get it.
Oh, yeah.
Holly and Sandy changed into clean clothing and tossed the bloody clothes into the rear cab of the truck. And without saying another word, the two climbed into the truck and sped off. Sarah's parents got home just as Holly and Sandy were leaving, and Sarah blurted out the story to her shocked mother, Jamie, who immediately called 911.
So Deputy Gibson of the Spalding County Sheriff's Office arrived at Sarah's minutes later. Sarah told the officer everything she knew and showed him a photo of Sandy Ketchum. He had the 15-year-old write out a one-page statement, and to verify the claims of the fleeing fugitives, deputies had to find out the identity of the victims. So they asked Sarah to try to reach the girls on their cell phone. With the okay of the officers, dialed *69 from her home phone, and that automatically redialed the last incoming call. Turned out to be Sarah Collier's cell phone. The call was not picked up. Sarah tried again and Sandy answered. Sarah asked her friend the name of Holly's grandparents because reports were all over the news about a double homicide in the county. She was bluffing because there was no news of the murders being aired yet.
Clever.
Sandy told her friend Sarah and Carl Collier. She added that they lived in Plantation Drive in Fayette County. Sarah told Sandy they had better get out of town quickly and asked where they would be heading, but the line went dead. Sarah tried redialing the number several times, but the calls were never picked up. So Sarah gave the information to the deputy who called it in. Then they waited. Sarah had a hard time believing Sandy could kill anybody, but she wouldn't have put it past Holly.
That's interesting, huh?
Holly had to be behind it all, Sarah felt, had never had a chance to be just a kid.
Well, that might be true. Now, from previous calls made by Holly, the police knew that Holly was using her grandparents' stolen cell phone when they had fled the Plantation Drive house. By this time, the U.S. Marshals Southeast Regional Fugitive Task Force was involved, and its purpose was to track down and arrest people when felony warrants were issued. The service had ways of tracking fugitives with any cell phone call. The Marshal Service has the capability of locating the phone to within a few feet, even when it's not turned on. So they knew the girls were heading southeast. When Tim and Beth Ketchum returned home from work on August 2nd, their answering machine was blinking. Their lives will never be the same. The message was from Tim's estranged sister, Glenda, who asked for Tim to call her. A man across the street from Glenda had been monitoring the police band radio, and he'd walked across the street to ask her if the Sandy Ketchum the police were looking for in connection with a double homicide in Riverdale was the daughter of her brother. Beth immediately dialed Glenda's number, but Glenda answered and refused to talk to her, telling her to just put her brother on the line. Tim took the phone, and seconds later, Tim hung up the phone, sat on the couch, and buried his face in his hands. Then he just sat there and cried, and Beth could not get him to speak one word. She quickly redialed Glenda's number and demanded to know what she had said to Tim that had him on the verge of collapse. Glenda finally told her, "Sandy's gone and killed some damn body. Is that good enough for you?" Then the line went dead. Now, before Beth could replace the phone receiver to its cradle, the top news story for the local 11 o'clock news had come on, and it was a report about the murders of the elderly couple in Riverdale, Carl and Sarah Collier. So heartbroken, the Ketchums drove over to a friend's house. The Spalding County Sheriff's deputies arrived and asked that they all stay at the house in case the girls returned. Sarah Polk, with detectives around her, called the number several times, and she got the voicemail each time. Concluding that Holly and Sandy wouldn't be answering or calling back anytime soon, the detectives returned to their offices at Fayette County Sheriff's Office. An all-points bulletin was put out on the missing truck that had belonged to Carl Collier. DA Bill McBroom had already decided to charge the girls as adults.
At 1:15 in the morning, the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force notified the Fayette County Sheriff's Office that Holly and Sandy were near Pooler, Georgia, which is on or near Interstate 16. They appeared to be driving in a southeast direction. So Jordan asked for volunteers to fly down to Daytona Beach, Florida that night. 2 detectives stopped at their respective homes on the way to the airport for a quick shower and a sandwich to go and pick up some spare clothes. The detectives arrived in Jacksonville at 5:55 a.m. and from there went to rent a car. Finally heading south to Daytona, in the car they discussed checking all the cheap motel parking lots along the strip. So early the next morning, investigators met with Tim and Beth Ketchum in the Sheriff's Public Information Office. The family expressed the desire to issue a plea to Sandy to turn herself in. They gave more information about her, including her behavioral problems. Beth Ketchum also told the police that she had found kitchen-style knives hidden in Sandy's bedroom several times in the past when she had gone to discipline her. The family also told them that Sandra, Sandy's biological mother, had told them her neighbor gave Sandy a ride to the Colliers' home on Sunday, the day before the murders.
Well, at approximately 9 a.m. on Tuesday, they had located Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum. U.S. Marshals dispatched from the Savannah office had quickly located the blue Chevy Silverado that was parked in a beachfront lot. The 2 detectives in Florida then turned around. Their trip would take about 50 minutes. So Brett Schremshock, 15, and his brother Brian Clayton, 22, had arrived on Tybee Island early in the morning. Along with their mom, Patricia, they had spent the day unpacking and getting their house ready to be lived in. At about 8 p.m., Patricia left for work at the local hospital in Savannah, where she was a registered nurse. The movers and her kids continued hauling in boxes and furniture. When the movers finally finished at around 9:30, the boys decided they needed a break and they went to check out their new surroundings. So they wandered a few blocks down the North Beach area of the island, and at about 10 p.m., they noticed 2 girls drive by in a blue truck. The truck stopped, turned around, and drove up to them. 2 young brown-haired girls asked them for a cigarette. The girls asked what they were up to, and Brian told them that he and his brother were going for a walk along the beach. The driver, who was the prettier of the 2 girls, asked if they could join them, since they were new to the island and didn't know their way around. So the boys waited as the girls parked the truck and then walked alongside Brian and Brett. Brett remembers that the girls were quiet, so his brother tried to talk to them. Brett and Brian told the girls they'd just moved to the island from the town of Winder, which was located between Athens and Atlanta. So when asked what their names were, the girls looked at each other before the pretty one said, Casey and Crystal. Brian got the feeling that they were lying. While strolling along the beach, the girls lit up a joint, and Holly asked the older boy if he could help them get rid of the truck. Then Holly showed them some gold jewelry that they wanted to pawn. She said it had belonged to her grandmother who had recently died. Then they surprised the boys by asking if they could spend the night at their house. So from their kitchen, Brian called his mom at work and asked if the 2 teenagers could stay. Patricia's answer was a quick hell no, and she told her son that they had just moved in, the house was a mess, and they didn't even know these people. But by this time, Brian couldn't force himself to kick them out, because they were already comatose on the mattress. So Patricia didn't know about this, but she woke up around 10 the next morning and was surprised to see teen girls come out of Brian's room. She pulled her older son aside and asked what they were doing there, since she had told him they couldn't stay. But Brian told her he was at a loss of what to do, since they'd quickly fallen asleep in his room. He apologized, and she nodded that she understood. So Patricia shrugged her shoulders. Brian and Brett both told their mother that they had gotten bad vibes from the girls and that something wasn't right about them. They couldn't help but notice how Casey and Crystal were always whispering to each other, and how one of them was abnormally quiet. Brian told his mom that the girls made him nervous, and that they were obviously up to something. He also said that the girls had said that they had taken a relative's truck. It didn't occur to him that they had stolen it. So Holly had finally approached Patricia, and the first words out of her mouth was whether she knew where a pawn shop was. So Patricia was taken aback. She said, well, no. She just arrived on the island herself, and she didn't know where anything was. But why in the world would a young girl like herself want to know where a pawn shop was? Well, Holly told her that her grandmother had died a couple of months ago and had left her some jewelry that she wanted to pawn. Patricia expressed her disapproval of her wanting to get rid of a family heirloom. She told Holly that both of her grandmothers were dead and she would never part with anything they had given her. But Holly showed her the jewelry, and after inspecting the gold bracelet and necklace, Patricia handed it back to her, saying that she was sorry but she couldn't help her. Then Patricia walked out of the room to find her son Brian. She cornered him in his room and told her elder son that there was something just not right about these girls and she wanted them to get the hell out of her house. She told Brian she thought the girls were runaways and that they had probably stolen the jewelry. So she sensed some real trouble and wanted the girls out of her house.
So Patricia observed that the one calling herself Crystal was really, really quiet and seemed very insecure. The one who said she was Casey was just the opposite and was obviously the one in charge.
Yeah, and that was Holly.
The phone in the house and the family's cell phones had not been activated yet, so Patricia asked Holly if she could use hers. She spent the next 45 minutes on the phone activating her cell phone. It was toward the end of her conversation with the service provider when she began to hear a helicopter. She went outside to look and saw it flying over the house. It's now about 11 o'clock in the morning. So Brian and Brett noticed that Holly and Sandy looked at each other with frightened faces when they realized a helicopter was flying overhead. They then got real quiet, and as soon as the boys left the room, they began hearing the girls nervously whispering to each other. Patricia had to go out on an errand, and she told her sons that if they needed her, call her on the cell phone.
So investigators cruised the beach area, and within minutes they found that parked 2002 Chevy Silverado pickup. The license plates were a match to the missing vehicle. The truck had belonged to Carla Collier. The Tybee Island police were asked to assist the Fayette County Sheriff's detectives in the apprehension of the two suspects. So the helicopter touched down next to the Tybee Island lighthouse at 11:15 a.m. Now a strategy for apprehending the suspects was mapped out. It would take several more hours for the U.S. Marshals Service's tracking system to hone in on the exact position of the cell phone signal. The marshals had finally pinpointed the signal of the target cell phone to 3 adjacent beach houses. All 3 were packed in tightly on the waterfront property. It was 1:50 p.m. when the woman next door had her house raided as they looked for Sandy and Holly. Along with the 2 girls, Brian watched the raid on his next-door neighbor's house from his bedroom window, and the girls were looking increasingly nervous. So he finally put 2 and 2 together and realized that the police were at the wrong house looking for the girls. So Brett ran out of the room and down the stairs to the carports out front and yelled to the cops. Were they looking for the girls? The excited boy blurted out, "They're here. We just met them on the beach last night." So the officers forced themselves into the house. They quickly encountered Brett and ordered him to the floor. Moments later, Brian walked into the room, and the officers demanded to know where the girls were. Brian pointed to the back bedroom door. So ordering him to join his brother on the floor, the police leapt over the brothers and stormed to the back where they broke down the door. So the frightened Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum were found holding each other in the small bedroom. They were handcuffed and thrown down onto the mattress on their stomachs. So they told the girls that they were under arrest for the murders of Carl and Sarah Collier. When they rolled Sandy over on her back to handcuff her, they saw a knife protruding from each of her pockets. Holly and Sandy were taken to the Chatham County Jail in Savannah, which had a juvenile facility. They'd be transported back to Fayetteville the next morning. When questioned by the admitting officer on why she was there, Holly said, "I killed my grandma and grandpa. Well, at least I think they died."
So due to the heinous nature of the crimes and the high visibility of the case, the 2 girls were examined by a prison psychologist that evening. Holly was tearful throughout the interview. When asked if she knew why she was locked up, she said, "I killed my grandma and grandpa." She then said there had been blood everywhere. I'll bet there was. I mean, if their clothes were that soaked with blood, the house must be a bloodbath.
Oh yeah, they stabbed these people to smithereens.
Holly told the prison psychologist that she had been living with her grandparents for the past 2 or 3 months. And before that, she was living with a friend's mom, Connie Earwood. Her mother, Carla, was in jail for selling marijuana to an undercover police officer, and she never saw her father. Holly said that she had been angry with her grandparents, but wouldn't say anything more. She did say that her grandparents had been hitting her, and that she was defending herself when she stabbed them. Holly also admitted to smoking 15 to 20 marijuana blunts a day.
Oh my God. How do you function and how do you afford it?
Those are two good questions.
Yeah.
I mean, of course.
How do you even find the time to smoke that much marijuana and stay awake?
You're a teenager. What do you do?
I don't think even as a teenager could have done that. That's amazing.
I'm just astounded. I mean, if she can smoke 15 to 20, she must be a pretty heavy user.
Yeah, there must have been some kind of buildup. Yeah. Because she also said she smoked some crack over the weekend, though.
Sure.
So in her mental health assessment, Sandy Ketchum admitted to extensive substance abuse problems and that she couldn't remember if she'd been high when she committed the crimes that she was there for. She did confess to smoking marijuana laced with cocaine the night before the murders. She didn't really remember the afternoon of August 2nd, other than everything happened so fast. In tears, she cried that she wished she were dead so that she didn't have to deal with this mess, and that she had given up hope for her life and just wanted to kill herself. When pressed how she would do it, she answered that she didn't know, but it would be the quickest way. Sandy rambled on about suicide, admitting to overdosing on some drugs 2 summers ago, but she couldn't remember why. She had also cut herself about 9 times with a knife, usually on her wrist. She had been put on risperidol for her sleeping problems, Depakote for her bipolar disorder, and Paxil for depression. Sandy complained that she'd had trouble sleeping for a year and that the risperidol was not helping, so her stepmother had taken her off of it. Sandy said she still had bad dreams and thoughts about being abused. She was talking about her third mother, her second stepmother. She admitted to losing her temper easily and reported that she'd broken her knuckles on a cement wall once when she was angry. So Holly and Sandy were loaded into 2 separate SUVs for the 250-mile drive back to Fayetteville. 2 female officers accompanied them. After arriving at the sheriff's office, Sandy and Holly were photographed and fingerprinted. Sandy was then turned over to the Warrant Division and was transported to Atlanta Metro Regional Youth Detention Center. Holly was taken to the Clayton County Regional Youth Detention Center.
So they're going to keep them separate?
Yeah, which I think is normal. That's what they do.
An autopsy was performed on the body of Sarah Collier at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in Atlanta on August 3, 2004. Carl had been dressed in a sleeveless ribbed undershirt, which was heavily saturated with liquid and clotted blood. On the upper right front of the shirt was an oval hole that corresponded to a stab wound to the chest. Carl's blue denim trousers were soaked in urine and blood. On closer examination, the medical examiner found a superficial knife wound on Mr. Collier's supraorbital ridge. It's like your eyebrow area. His right ear was partially amputated. On the right lateral side of his head, extending down to his neck, was a 6.5 centimeter slashing wound. On the upper surface of the right shoulder, at the base of the neck, were a total of 4 superficial incisions. His neck had a more serious wound. The gaping wound began at the left mid-clavicle area and extended inward 5.7 centimeters across and down. The knife had struck the first thoracic vertebrae. It had also opened the carotid artery. That's not good.
No, that was definitely deadly.
You bleed out of that pretty fast. This created a gaping, massively hemorrhagic wound.
I'm sure it did.
The track of the knife sliced into the esophagus and the trachea and down into the lung.
See, isn't this brutal?
This is a vicious attack, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
Another stab wound was found in the mid-sternal region, slightly to the right of the midline. Several more superficial wounds were found in this area, but on the upper right thorax, which is the back of the chest below the base of the neck, there is a gaping teardrop-shaped incision. A total of 8 superficial and deep stab wounds to the face, head, and neck, and 9 more in his chest and back, all contributed to death by exsanguination. Well, all you got to do is get the carotid, really.
Yeah.
The rest is just dressing.
It's overkill, for sure.
According to the chief medical examiner's report, the coup de grace was the wound that had penetrated his left neck, incising the aorta, which led to massive internal and external hemorrhaging. Sarah Collier had bled to death from multiple stab wounds.
Well, an autopsy of Sarah followed her husband's that same day, and her Hawaiian floral print shirt was saturated with blood, with one very large gaping hole that corresponded to a stab wound. Her floral print shorts were heavily blood-stained and had defects associated with stab wounds as well. On the lateral left neck, below the angle of her jaw, was a horizontally oriented 3.3 centimeter stab wound incision. On the right parietal scalp, the back of her head, was a stab wound that had perforated the right parietal bone into the cranial vault, slightly penetrating the brain. Now, on the right breast above the nipple, there was a 4.5 centimeter stab wound incision, which extended deeply into the tissues of her breast. And on the upper right breast, there was a large gaping stab wound, which was 13 centimeters in length. So the margins of the wound were focally irregular, reflecting removal of the blade and then reinsertion during the course of the infliction of this wound. On the mid-anterior thorax, chest, was an inverted, angulated, gaping stab wound, measuring 13 centimeters in length, and on the right lower abdomen there was a large 6.5 centimeter stab wound. So the knife had penetrated into the thoracic cavity and incised the lower lobe of her right lung. At the juncture of the right arm with the left shoulder, there was also a large 6 centimeter stab wound that transected her axillary artery, causing massive hemorrhaging that had led to exsanguination. On the right forearm, there was another deep slash wound, which was 11.5 centimeters, and this had penetrated deep into the musculature and severed numerous tendons. So the medical examiner concluded that Sarah Collier had sustained multiple stab wounds of the head, neck, chest, abdomen, and both arms. The wound that had entered the right shoulder, transecting the right axillary artery, led to the massive exsanguinating hemorrhage and her death. So the manner of death, like that of her husband's, was homicide.
And particularly gruesome. I mean, these were severe wounds.
Yeah.
And the rage and strength that went with that is just incredible.
It is, and my notes may have overdone it a bit, but I really felt like we needed to get the point across. And that does, right?
Yeah, this is a bloodbath.
Yeah, it really was.
So in its September 20th, 2004 edition, People magazine covered the Colliers' murders. Killer grandkid? ? Was the headline, with the underlying copy. Holly Harvey's grandparents tried to save her. Instead, police say the teen and a friend murdered them. The article told how the rebellious 15-year-old had threatened her grandparents and how 5 days later the blood-soaked bodies were found. Much written about, but uncorroborated, were the words kill, keys, money, jewelry, supposedly seen on Holly's arm in ink.
Yeah, but the most sensational and prejudicial was the description of the murders. Holly attacked her grandmother with a kitchen knife while Sandy, who'd been lying in wait, leapt out to help Holly. The popular, wildly circulated magazine quoted Sandy as telling police, "I finished with Mrs. Collier, then went to join Holly, who had chased her grandfather up the stairs." So with this pre-trial publicity, the defense attorneys for the two accused teenage murderers worried about them getting a fair trial. Attorney Judy Chidester, along with her colleague Lloyd Walker, were determined that Holly would get all the protection of federal and state law that she was entitled to. Both Fayette County lawyers knew that there would come a time when their respective clients' interests would force them to part ways, because a common defense would not be possible. According to Chidester, Holly appeared to comprehend most of their private conversations regarding the seriousness of the charges against her. Lloyd Walker publicly denounced the news media's use of so-called experts who were theorizing about motives and analyzing different aspects of the case. He suggested that they didn't have the facts and, consequently, were in no position to make any informed decisions.
Yeah, but that's not going to stop them.
No, because that's their job, really. But he said they were prejudicing the jury pool. Walker was not oblivious to the public's right to know, but said the uninformed speculation on behalf of experts is counterproductive. So 10 a.m. on August 12th, Holly and Sandy were led into a packed courtroom in the Fayette County Courthouse in Fayetteville. 4 TV news cameras taped the proceeding. Sandy's defense attorney, Lloyd Walker, quickly called 2 witnesses to the stand, Tim and Beth Ketchum. Tim Ketchum appeared emotionally drained and tired as he told the sad story of his daughter's life. He went into detail about Sandy's natural mother who deserted her, and then the succession of 3 stepmothers. Ketchum described her second stepmother as physically abusive to Sandy and the whole relationship as bad, saying that the stepmother had always tried to get Sandy into trouble. Ketchum also related how her 4th mom, his present wife Beth, had a good relationship with Sandy, and how she'd done her best in raising the teen for the past 4 years. Out of exasperation, Tim told the court that he and Beth had acceded to Sandy's wishes to get her to know her real mom, Sandra Maddox. On the advice of Sandy's probation officer, they'd even permitted her to move in with Sandra in her home in Griffin, with the understanding that Sandy was not permitted to see Holly. But Tim claimed that Sandra had paid no heed to these warnings and had allowed the 2 teenage girls to see each other.
So Beth Ketchum took the stand next, and under questioning by Lloyd Walker, said she had no major problems with her stepdaughter. She added, "Sandy and I have always gotten along." Finished questioning Sandy's latest stepmother, Lloyd Walker took his seat. Assistant District Attorney Dan Hyatt took the floor to cross-examine Tim Ketchum. He asked about Sandy's temper. Ketchum admitted that his little girl would hide knives in her bedroom whenever she got upset.
So the ADA then called Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Jordan to the stand, where he told in detail how the bodies had been found and the numerous stab wounds that had been inflicted on the elderly couple. Jordan also claimed that the 3 missing knives from the Collier residence had been found in the stolen truck. So when Jordan finished his testimony, Lloyd Walker pleaded that his client Sandy Ketchum was a juvenile, and a lot of people had failed her, but the judge quickly denied bond. As the girls were let out of the courtroom, Tim Ketchum and Kevin Collier's paths crossed in the lobby, and these 2 men embraced each other without saying a word.
So the DA's office decided to try both 15-year-old Holly and 16-year-old Sandy as adults. The district attorney would not comment on the strength of the case on legal grounds, but he would say he had no hesitation trying his case anywhere, alluding to the fact that there was talk about getting a change of venue. Trying the case in Fayette County did present some problems for the defense. It's a conservative county, so history and location did not bode well for the defense.
Yeah, but I'd say nothing really bodes well for the defense. This is a horrific crime.
Yeah, it's true.
It is. So Kathleen M. Hyde, Ph.D., is a professor of criminology at the University of South Florida in Tampa, and she's one of the leading international experts on juvenile homicide and parricide, also a frequent expert witness in homicide trials involving youths. So in her career, she's evaluated over 100 kids who've killed, and she's the author of Why Kids Kill Parents and Young Killers. So Hyde, when evaluating cases like the murders of the Colliers, often sees a pattern where the kids have not had discipline or boundaries while growing up. So Hyde calls this a form of child abuse. Typically, in the cases of young killers who lived in undisciplined households during their formative years, when a suddenly aware parent, a new parent, a grandparent, or a guardian tries to establish new rules, the juvenile rebels, and the outcome rarely leads to homicide, but it does lead to bad things. So these undisciplined children, says Hyde, are not learning how to deal with frustration. They're not realizing that the world doesn't revolve around them, and sometimes in life you don't get what you want. Children have to learn to deal with that. So around the age of 12 to 17, when a parent or authority figure tries to instill discipline, the teenager will see this as someone who wants to change the rules. The teenager in these cases has a level of personality development like a much younger child, so they have no sense of accountability for their behavior. And this is the scenario where cases of homicide can result. But Hyde also adds that there's no real way to predict it. Typically, there are only 1,000 to 1,500 cases a year where teenagers commit murder. The best predictor of violence, says Hyde, is other minor incidents of violence or the threat of violence. So, of the average high figure of 1,500 homicides committed by juveniles, fewer than 10% of them were perpetrated by girls. And of those, just a handful of the victims were a parent or a family member. So when the female murderer does kill a parent or family member, they often have accomplices or they act in groups. Hyde has found that female teenage murderers of a parent or a guardian were frequently involved in gang activity, were concealing a pregnancy, were protecting a love interest, or having their activities interfered with by the parent. Alcohol and drugs can also be an aggravating factor in any homicide. They can affect perception and inhibitions. Cocaine and methamphetamine use can have consequences. These two drugs can cause acute agitation among users, and when coupled with anger, alienation, and low personality development, violent responses can be expected.
Helen Smith, a forensic psychologist in Knoxville, Tennessee, says that many kids who kill are narcissistic. Smith has said, other people's lives mean nothing to them, and they tend to go into a rage if somebody tries to put limits on them. One of them probably wouldn't have done anything, but get them together with their distorted thinking. That can escalate into violence. Smith relates that teenage girl patients of hers have told her that killing gave them a sense of power, and that they say, I could feel that person dying. For girls, it is an intimate act. The choice of weapons by young killers is also telling. Multiple stabbings of victims, most experts agree, indicates a pattern of rage and dissociation. In frenzied state, there is a stress response, or a kind of looping behavior, where there is a loss of control. When the person is enraged, there is a flood of emotion, where the response becomes uncontrollable. Frenzied stabbing attacks suggest strong emotion, hatred, and pent-up anger. Professor Hyde says that in these cases, the young murderer's mental competence can be called into question.
Oh, absolutely. So Holly and Sandy were offered their options and ultimately decided to plead guilty. Holly was sentenced to 2 life sentences after pleading guilty to 2 counts of malice murder. Because of her age, she wasn't eligible for the death penalty, and she will be eligible for parole after serving 20 years in prison. Sandy was sentenced to serve 3 life sentences to be served consecutively, but she could be out in 10 years. During the hearings, the girls both spoke about the stabbings of 74-year-old Carl and 73-year-old Sarah Collier. Now Sandy has been released from prison and is living in Georgia. Holly is eligible for parole this year, but she remains incarcerated at Lee Arundel State Prison in Alto, Georgia. So the 2 served their time in different prisons.
So what about psychiatric care or rehabilitation in prison?
Hey, there's an idea.
Well, all we know is that Sandy was released.
Yeah, that's all we do know.
Okay.
I mean, if she did undergo any kind of psychiatric treatment, I don't think it would be open to the public to know about it anyway.
Yeah.
But I would hope there was some.
Oh, yeah.
I would hope someone that young with such a severe crime, something would be done.
If you can think there's any hope of salvation, you try to do that.
I know, but really, do the United States prison system really believe in that? Not a lot.
No.
No, it's really more about punishment. But you would think at such a young age with all these psychosocial issues that would be a priority. And I hope it was, but I wasn't really able to find out any details about that at all.
Yeah.
So a couple reminders before we move on to our feedback. We have a premium option, if you don't know, where you can get early, ad-free, and bonus shows. Also, if you join, we'll give you a gift, some TCB swag, and a thank you note. We do at least 1 bonus show every month, and we've been looking at a couple of true crime documentaries we've enjoyed that we've recapped, and that will be coming out in October and November. So if this interests you at all, we would appreciate it very much. It's a great way to support the show. And you can subscribe at tygrabber.com/subscribe or at patreon.com/tygrabber for the same benefits. Other ways we ask you to support the show are to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Getting those reviews really helps us to find new listeners. And we always appreciate getting an email or a voicemail with comments or case suggestions. Also, we'd appreciate it if you'd tell your friends who enjoy true crime to check out our show. If you do have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tygrabber.com, or you can record a voicemail by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website. And I hope you will do that. So we're going to do some feedback. We've got some voicemails and emails.
It's time for listener feedback.
Okay, so first up in feedback, we have a voicemail from Allison.
Hi, Jill and Dickie. This is Allison here from Montreal, where, yes, we have fabulous breweries. Thank you for the lovely handwritten notes, stickers, and magnets that you sent. It's always a treat to find something in the mail. Dickie, my partner, will not listen to true crime, but he thinks you sound like Wayne Gretzky. That's high praise. So I can listen to you and Jill at night as I fall asleep. Don't worry, I make sure to listen to the episodes when I'm awake and cognizant. You and Jill just have such soothing voices. Each of your episodes is well researched and compassionately told. I'm just curious, as a researcher myself, who does the researcher for your episodes, and how do you approach the research for each case? I do have a case suggestion out of Montreal that's not discussed very often. I think I've heard maybe 1 or 2 podcasts cover a portion of it. It's a little insane, so hold on to your butts. When I was growing up in the West Island of Montreal, there was a serial killer lurking in the shadows. As a community, we wouldn't learn about him until after we'd already experienced collective trauma. We're now known as the Beaconsfield Bermuda Triangle, the name given to us because of the significant amount of crime that would occur all within a square kilometer radius. When I was 9, my mother sat me down in the library school to explain that 3 boys from the local high school had bludgeoned a minister and his wife to death. These 3 would all be tried as juveniles and unfortunately go on to reoffend. 4 years later, my girl guide leader would find one of her clients stabbed to death. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. William Patrick Fife would be prosecuted for the deaths of 5 women, including the woman my girl guide leader found, but confessed to 9. Very little media attention was given to the case, as there was some sort of agreement in place between the prosecution, the media, and law enforcement that he could just quietly go do his time in Saskatchewan. So a lot of people in Montreal actually aren't aware of him, which is wild. He's also suspected of being the serial rapist known as the Plumber, who violently raped women in Montreal in the 80s. So by the time I got to high school, I was no longer fazed by violent death. It seemed very familiar and likely to happen to anyone at any time. My conclusion would then be validated when a couple were murdered by their son, followed shortly after a familicide, where a man would murder his wife, 3 sons, one who attended my school, and his business partner as well, who was the father of a son in my grade. Familicides are very rare, so it was shocking when it happened again a few years later when my Pilates instructor, Mila, or her husband, who is actually a psychologist, murdered her and her 2 daughters. Again, all of this happened within a square kilometer radius, so it's a lot to take in, and you could focus on any of the cases. I think there's a lot there to be learned and explored. Anyways, sorry to be so morbid and dark. Your podcast is truly a light in my life, so thank you for all of your hard work.
Thank you, Allison. That was heavy, and that was 2 voicemails put together if it sounds a little choppy. But just a remarkable voicemail. We did look up the serial killer, and were able to find some articles on 2 of the other cases as well. So research is done primarily by me. We used to have our son help us out with it, but then he got too busy with college and everything. So my basic research method is that I primarily just go online and do like a very deep dive and look for all I can get. And then I go into court filings. So I'll go into websites where I have memberships where I can get filings on all sorts of court cases. And that's very helpful. And then depending on what the issue is, I'll usually go into some kind of research forum like a psychology or a medicine-based sort of thing. So yeah, it's pretty extensive, depending on the case, of course. Some of them are much simpler than others. But this whole thing that you've told us about, very traumatic, and I definitely want to look more into that for sure. I can't imagine what kind of perspective you get on the world. You know, you grow up with that kind of thing. You're going to look at things differently maybe than other people who don't have to confront that at such a young age.
Yeah, those are several cases. We got some good stuff to go through.
Absolutely. So you said there was one that you really thought we should cover.
Yeah, the one that looked the most interesting was William Patrick Fife. He's a Canadian serial killer convicted of killing 5 women between 1979 and 1999. Now, since his conviction, he has confessed to 4 other murders. But the thing with this is, when you look at the original 5 that he was charged with, there was 1 in 1979 and 4 in 1999. So what did he do in those 20 years in between?
Well, it does make you wonder, huh? Seems like there might be more.
I'll bet there's more than 4 others.
Yeah, you're probably right.
But that's something that we can look up.
All right. Thanks again, Allison. And we have a voicemail from Dallas.
Hi, I am, voicemailing with a suggestion on a case that I would love to hear you cover. It is the botched abduction of Sydney Riso. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Murderish. That is another podcast. I believe it's episode 40-ish. But it was covered there. Honest to God, these are the worst criminals I have ever heard of. And I was just about crying, laughing, listening to that episode. And that's not even really an episode where the host makes any kind of commentary or anything. Just when you think it can't get any stupider, it does. So it, besides being kind of just an interesting case, if y'all haven't looked into that one, you are in for a treat. But I would be absolutely delighted to listen to your take on it. And yeah.
Well, thanks, Dallas.
So Sydney Riso was the vice president at Exxon. And on April 29th, 1992, he was kidnapped by Arthur Seal and his wife, Irene. Riso was placed in an airtight box, mistake number 1, and died within a few days.
So they didn't mean for him to die?
No, he was going to be held for ransom.
Oh, okay.
So they tried to get a ransom for him, I think about 3 times. But a variety of blunders were unable to collect it. And it wouldn't have made any difference anyway, because he'd already died.
Well, that's just kind of sad. Comedy of errors. A little Fargo-esque, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then before we get to the emails, I just want to say thank you to Vicky, who left a very nice voicemail telling us how great we are. But there was a dog barking in the background, one of hers, or 2 of hers.
Okay. So we couldn't play it, but we appreciate it.
Well, we didn't play it because it's just praise.
Yes.
We get enough praise.
Okay, but this one must have been special because...
It was special because of the dog barking. That's all.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, we have an email from Jess. So I'll read this one. Dear Jill and Dick, just wanted to thank you for your recent coverage of Michael Ballard and the murder of Denise Mary and 3 others. I'm related to the next-door neighbor who was killed when he tried to intervene. Everything I've read and heard about the murders seems to ignore what a good person Steve Zernhelt was, and he's often referred to only as a neighbor. Of course, Steve's death was just as tragic to his family, and I just appreciate you giving him some attention and credit for his selfless actions. That said, I'm writing to recommend the case of Randy Weaver and the Randy Weaver family, also known as the Ruby Ridge case. In the summer of 1992, 3 people were killed when the federal government went to war with one family armed with extensive weaponry. There is really a lot to be learned from this fascinating story, but I'll say no more in case you cover it and I don't want to spoil it. Thanks again for all you do, Jess in Idaho. Well, thanks, Jess. Yeah, it really was heartbreaking that Steve Zernhelt ran over to the neighbors to try and be of help and lost his life.
And got killed for doing that.
Yeah, and totally talk about an innocent victim completely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks, Jess. And we have one more email from Julie. Do you want to read that one?
Sure. Julie had a comment on Jean Kerr in the recent case, The 2 Wives of Thomas Kerr. So Julie says, Jean reminds me of Micah Miller, the preacher's wife whose husband seduced her while he was married, and she was 14 years old in her church youth group.
Ew.
She then allegedly killed herself by suicide years later when they had been married. A case I wouldn't mind you covering, by the way, though it's still fresh.
Yes, very recent. I believe it was April of this year.
Well, that's recent.
Yeah. On April 27th, Micah was seen in CCTV footage leaving her home in South Carolina at 11:38 a.m., and she went to a pawn shop where she bought a gun. She called 911 just before 3 p.m. and asked the dispatcher if she could track her location. She said she was about to kill herself and wanted her family to know where to find her. I won't go into more detail, but there are many online conspiracies about her death, and a lot of blame has been pointed toward her husband, John Paul. There is some evidence that she was an abused woman who was afraid for her life, And there's a TikTok account with the name #JusticeForMicah, where there are threatening posts from John Paul, things he had posted when she was alive, I believe. So another case of domestic violence with a twist in the end, I guess, that she actually may have killed herself, it seems like.
Well, I guess it sounds like she did.
Yeah, but I think the family's not convinced. Her family.
Oh, well, just without knowing anything really more of the case, I think if she gets seduced at age 14, I mean, he's got to be at least 15 or 20 years older than her.
Yep.
Right?
I would guess. I don't think it matters how much older. I think it matters that she's a child more than anything.
That's what I was pointing out.
Whether he was 21 or 41, it's illegal and bad.
Well, she was 14.
Right.
And I'm just thinking that they ended up being married. I don't know that I'd want to marry that guy if he's after barely pubertal children.
Well, yeah. I don't know if anyone does want to marry him.
Well, okay.
But she probably didn't have much choice. If she was that young when she met him, it sounds like there was some domestic violence or grooming. Something was not quite right there.
Yeah, we'll have to look into that.
Yes. So we'll look into that some more, too.
All right.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Julie. And thank you all for listening. We appreciate it so much. And we will see you next time at The Quiet End.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.